The 7-year-old daughter told her father something terrible about the stepmother. After hearing it, he made an unexpected decision to hide in the closet. What he witnessed left him in utter shock. The afternoon sunlight streamed softly through the half-closed curtains, casting long shadows across the small living room. Tiago, a man in his early 40s, sat on the worn couch, staring blankly at the television, which was droning out the latest news updates. Yet his mind was miles away, lost in the difficult, chaotic months that had followed a devastating loss. It had been a little over a year since his wife, Elizabeth, the love of his life and the mother of his young daughter, Julia, had died in a car accident. The tragedy had shaken their small family to its core. Those months had been a whirlwind of grief, adjustments, and an ache that never really seemed to fade. But through it all, Julia had been his anchor, her presence reminding him daily of his purpose. Together, they had slowly begun to rebuild their lives. Then came Sandra. Tiago had met her not long after he returned to work. She was strikingly attractive, with an infectious smile and a personality that instantly drew people in. She had recently been promoted to the head of human resources, and the two of them initially shared nothing more than a polite, professional relationship. But casual conversations over coffee soon evolved into shared lunches and, eventually, into regular outings. Before he fully realized it, Sandra had become a presence in his life, and eventually, in his home. And now, Sandra had officially moved in. She seemed to fill the house with a warmth that Tiago hoped would ease the pain of the past year. But lately, he'd begun to sense a strange tension, especially around Julia. He'd brushed it off as adjustment pains, after all. It wasn't easy for a young child to accept a new person in the household. But he'd noticed Julia growing quieter, her usually bright demeanor dampening. A faint sound in the hallway pulled Tiago out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Julia, his beloved daughter, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Normally bright and full of chatter, Julia now looked withdrawn, her shoulders slumped, eyes cast down to the floor. "Julia, sweetheart, are you okay?" Tiago asked, rising from the couch, concern filling his voice. He could see her cheeks were flushed and her eyes puffy, as if she'd been crying. A knot of worry tightened in his chest. Julia bit her lower lip and looked up, her eyes glistening. "Dad, can we talk?" she murmured, her voice so soft he could barely hear it. "Of course, darling," he said, gently patting the space on the couch beside him. Julia approached slowly, keeping a noticeable distance from him as she sat. Tiago felt a pang of unease. This wasn't like her at all. "What happened, my dear? You know you can tell me anything." He tried to keep his tone light, though the worry was evident in his face. Julia fiddled nervously with the hem of her dress, avoiding his gaze. I don't know how to say it, Dad," she whispered. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm your dad, and I'll always be here for you." Tiago's voice was steady, but inside, his heart raced. Julia took a deep breath, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. He saw something in her gaze that he hadn't seen before, a mix of fear and hesitation. "It's about Aunt Sandra," she said, her voice wavering. Tiago's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, my love?" he asked gently, bracing himself. Julia bit her lip again, gathering the courage to speak. She hurts me," Julia said, her small voice breaking. In that moment, Tiago's world stopped. "Hurts you? How?" he asked, feeling his throat tighten. Julia's eyes welled up with fresh tears, and her voice quivered. "When you're not home, she gets mad at me. She yells, says mean things, and sometimes she grabs my arm really hard." Her words were barely a whisper, yet they echoed loudly in Tiago's mind. Stunned, he struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. "Julia, are you absolutely sure? Maybe she didn't mean to hurt you, maybe she was just playing." Julia shook her head, her face crumpling as she tried to keep her composure. "No, Dad. It's not a joke. It really hurts, and I'm scared. Please believe me." Tiago's heart broke, seeing the raw fear in his daughter's eyes. Every fiber of his being wanted to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, but the pain in her gaze was undeniable. I believe you, sweetheart, he said softly, opening his arms. Julia leaned in, collapsing against him as fresh sobs racked her small body. Tiago held her tightly, feeling his own tears prickling at the edges of his eyes. I'm so sorry, my love. I'm so sorry. They stayed like that for several minutes, Tiago stroking her hair as her sobs subsided. When she had calmed down a little, he gently pulled back, looking into her tear-streaked face. Julia, I need to know everything, he said. Can you tell me exactly what's been happening? Julia nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. It started a little after Aunt Sandra moved in. At first, she would just yell at me if I did something wrong. But then she started pushing me, grabbing me. Sometimes she whispers things, like that you don't love me anymore and that I'm just a silly little girl. Her voice trailed off, and she looked down, clearly feeling ashamed. Tiago's anger grew with each word, his chest tightening. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I was scared, Julia admitted, her voice barely audible. She said if I told you, you'd be mad at me and send me away, that no one would believe me because she's an adult. Tiago's heart shattered. Julia, I would never, ever send you away. You are the most important person in my life, and I promise, I'll always believe you and protect you. Julia gave a tentative nod, but Tiago could still see doubt lingering in her eyes. Promise you're not mad at me? She asked timidly. I promise, he replied, gently kissing her forehead. None of this is your fault. After a moment, he pulled back and steeled himself for what he needed to do next. Julia, I need to check if you're hurt, okay? Can you show me where Sandra hurt you? Julia nodded slowly and pushed up her sleeves. Tiago's eyes widened as he saw bruises on her small arms, some faint and yellowing, others fresh and deep purple. He felt his stomach churn. My God, he whispered, barely able to contain the mix of anger and guilt roiling inside him. Julia, is there anywhere else? With a shy nod, she lifted the hem of her dress, revealing even more bruises on her legs. Tiago took a deep breath, his gaze steady and piercing, refusing to back down. The sight of those bruises on Julia's delicate skin kept flashing through his mind, fueling the determination he felt now. He wasn't going to let Sandra talk her way out of this. Not this time. Sandra's attempt at a reassuring smile faltered, revealing cracks in her confidence. She was visibly flustered, her hands fidgeting nervously as she stammered. Tiago, I can't believe you're taking this seriously. Kids say things, they make things up sometimes. Maybe Julia misunderstood. She can be sensitive, you know. Tiago clenched his fists, struggling to contain his rising anger. Sensitive? You're going to tell me that the bruises, the marks, her tears, that all of this is just in her head? His voice grew sharper, unwavering, as he took a step closer. Julia was afraid to tell me because you threatened her. You've been tormenting my daughter, and you thought you could hide it forever. Sandra's expression wavered between desperation and defiance. She tried to steady her voice, but there was a slight tremor in her tone. You're being dramatic, Tiago. I would never harm her. She must have misunderstood my actions. Maybe she just didn't like the rules I set. Tiago's face darkened, his patience wearing thin. Rules? You mean telling her she's unwanted? Calling her useless? Making her afraid to leave her room? That's not discipline, Sandra. That's abuse. For a moment, Sandra seemed at a loss for words, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Fine, she finally spat out, her voice filled with resentment. Maybe I'm strict with her, but do you know how hard it's been for me? Trying to build a life with you when you're still clinging to your perfect memories of Elizabeth and this kid who's always in the way. The words hit Tiago like a slap to the face. He had never imagined that the woman who had been so warm, so kind at the beginning, could harbor such bitterness toward his daughter. Any remaining hope that this was a misunderstanding dissolved instantly. Julia is my daughter. She will always come first, he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. You clearly never cared about her well-being, only about what you could get from this family. You lied to me, manipulated me. But this ends now. Sandra's demeanor shifted, realizing her attempts at denial and manipulation were failing. Her expression grew cold, even calculating. "Oh, you think you can just toss me out now, after all I've sacrificed? Don't forget, Tiago, I left a stable life to be with you. You owe me." Tiago took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. He looked Sandra directly in the eye, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "I owe you nothing, Sandra. Whatever you think you sacrificed, it's nothing compared to what you've stolen from Julia. From now on, you're out of her life, and I'll make sure you can never hurt her again." Sandra's face paled, but she quickly masked her reaction, feigning indignation. "You'll regret this, Tiago. You're making a huge mistake." He merely shook his head. "The only mistake I made was ever letting you into our lives." As Sandra grabbed her bag and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, Tiago felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He knew this wasn't over. She would likely attempt to make things difficult, but standing up for his daughter, protecting her from someone he had once trusted, gave him a renewed sense of purpose. When he returned to Julia's room, he found her huddled on her bed, her eyes wide with worry. She looked up at him, searching his face for reassurance. "It's over, my love," he said softly, sitting beside her and pulling her into his arms. "Sandra's gone, and she won't be coming back." Julia's small body relaxed against him, the relief palpable as she whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Over the next few weeks, Tiago took steps to ensure their lives returned to a place of peace and healing. He filed a report, gathered evidence of the abuse, and took Julia to a counselor who could help her process what she had endured. For the first time in months, he saw a genuine smile return to her face, a small sign that their lives were moving towards something better. The experience had been painful, but it had also deepened Tiago's bond with his daughter. He promised himself, and her, that he would never let anyone harm her again. They had faced a dark chapter, but together, they would create a new story, one filled with trust, safety, and unconditional love. Tiago's words hung in the air, and Julia's face instantly clouded with worry. He quickly reached out, holding her small hand to reassure her. "Just for a few days, my love," he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I promise. I won't leave you alone with her for a single second. I need to know, beyond any doubt, what's really happening." Julia looked down, fiddling with her spoon, clearly upset but trying to process what he was saying. "But Dad, what if she hurts me again?" Her voice wavered, and Tiago's heart twisted at the fear in her tone. "I won't let that happen, Julia. I'll be here, watching, the entire time," he said, his voice filled with gentle reassurance. "I'll keep you safe. I promise." After a long pause, Julia nodded, though her expression was still filled with hesitation. Tiago knew he was asking a lot from her, but he needed this confirmation, for both of them. As he prepared for Sandra's return, Tiago felt the weight of the days ahead pressing heavily on his shoulders. He arranged for Sandra to come back that evening, telling her they'd try to work things out as a family. When he heard her car pull up in the driveway, he took a steadying breath. His eyes met Julia's across the room, and he gave her a reassuring nod. Sandra entered the house cautiously, her eyes sweeping over the room before settling on Tiago and Julia. "Thank you for letting me come back, Tiago," she said, her voice dripping with a mix of relief and forced humility. "I know I've made mistakes, but I'm ready to prove to you that I love you both." Tiago simply nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. "Let's focus on making things comfortable for Julia," he replied calmly, making it clear that his priority was his daughter's well-being. For the first few days, Sandra's behavior was markedly different. She played the role of a caring, attentive partner, offering to cook dinners, help Julia with her schoolwork, and even suggesting family activities. Tiago watched her closely, noting every gesture, every word, and every interaction with Julia. For a while, he wondered if perhaps Sandra was capable of change, but a dark feeling lingered, a nagging suspicion that this new behavior was just a mask. On the fourth night, Tiago made his move. He told Sandra he had to stay late at work, but in reality, he parked a short distance from the house, waiting for the right moment. Then, as quietly as possible, he slipped back inside and hid in the closet of Julia's room, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could see and hear what happened. Not long after he had hidden himself, Sandra entered Julia's room. Her entire demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the sweetness she had been showing for days. Her voice was low and harsh as she scolded Julia over a trivial matter, her words laced with disdain. "Do you think your father loves you? Poor little Julia, always needing attention," she sneered, crossing her arms. "You're the reason he's never truly happy." Tiago's blood boiled as he watched, but he forced himself to stay silent, needing more evidence. Julia looked down, gripping her blanket as Sandra continued. "You should be grateful I even tolerate you. You're nothing but a burden, and it's about time you realize it." In that moment, Tiago felt his patience snap. He stepped out of the closet, his face filled with fury and betrayal. "Sandra, that's enough." His voice was sharp, echoing through the small room. Sandra spun around, her face a mix of shock and fear. Tiago could see that she knew she'd been caught, and there was no talking her way out of it this time. Sandra stammered, "Tiago, I was just trying to help her understand." But Tiago shook his head, his voice cold. "No more lies, Sandra. I've heard enough. You were cruel to my daughter, and I let you back into this home, hoping you'd prove me wrong. But you showed me exactly who you are." He knelt down beside Julia, wrapping an arm around her as she clung to him. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered to her, then turned his gaze back to Sandra, who was now visibly panicking. "Tiago, please," she begged. "I can change, I swear." But Tiago had already made up his mind. "Leave. Now," he said, his voice unyielding. "You'll never come near my daughter again." Sandra grabbed her things, casting one last pleading look, but he didn't waver. With a heavy, final sigh, she left, the sound of the door closing behind her filling the house with a sense of relief. After she was gone, Tiago hugged Julia tightly, promising her that Sandra would never hurt her again. For the first time in days, he saw a true smile on his daughter's face, a sign that, at last, they could begin to heal. The voices that drifted through the closet door made Tiago's heart pound in his chest. Each minute inside the cramped space felt like an eternity, as he strained to catch every word, every sound, praying he'd find the answer he sought. As the hours passed, the muffled conversations between Sandra and Julia seemed relatively normal. Tiago heard Sandra asking Julia about her dolls, suggesting they watch cartoons, and offering to make tea in the kitchen. Julia's responses were quiet and cautious, and though Sandra's tone was light, Tiago couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the time dragged on, Tiago's patience began to wear thin. A small voice in the back of his mind started questioning everything. Could I have been mistaken? He wondered, shifting uncomfortably in the tight closet. Maybe Sandra truly cares for Julia, and my fears are nothing more than paranoia. Could Julia have exaggerated because she felt neglected? The doubt gnawed at him, yet his heart couldn't forget the fear in his daughter's eyes when she'd recounted Sandra's cruel words and actions. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Tiago decided he had observed enough. He quietly slipped out of the closet, careful not to make a sound as he exited the apartment, and waited a few minutes in the hallway before re-entering, as if he had just arrived home from work. "Hi, everyone," he greeted them, forcing a natural smile. "How was your day?" Sandra turned to him with a bright smile that seemed almost rehearsed. "It was wonderful, honey. Julia and I had a great time. Didn't we, Julia?" She cast a look at Julia, who sat at the kitchen table, her posture tense, her gaze fixed on her hands. Julia hesitated, then nodded, barely meeting her father's eyes. Tiago noticed a slight quiver in her lower lip, a detail Sandra seemed oblivious to. His heart sank, realizing his daughter was struggling to maintain the brave face they had talked about. The tension in the room was almost palpable, and though Sandra's demeanor was warm and friendly, Tiago's instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. They all sat down for dinner together, the atmosphere tense as they shared small talk. Sandra did most of the talking, filling the air with anecdotes about her day and tales of how much fun she and Julia had together. But as Tiago observed Julia's quiet, subdued demeanor, his doubts resurfaced. Could Sandra truly be as manipulative as Julia described, or had she genuinely bonded with Julia during the day? After dinner, Tiago cleared his throat, deciding it was time to confront the issue head-on. "Sandra, there's something we need to discuss," he began, his tone calm but firm. Sandra's smile wavered slightly, her eyes darting between him and Julia. "Oh, what's on your mind, dear?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Tiago leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Julia mentioned some concerning things to me. She's told me that sometimes you get angry with her when I'm not here, that you say hurtful things, and even to put your hands on her." Sandra's face twisted into a look of disbelief, quickly followed by a forced laugh. "Tiago, are you serious? You're taking the words of a 7-year-old child over mine? Kids exaggerate things all the time, especially when they're feeling jealous. Julia's probably just upset that I'm here and that I'm spending time with you." Tiago's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone measured. "Sandra, I want to believe you, but the bruises on her arms tell a different story. You told me Julia's just clumsy, but those marks look suspiciously like fingerprints. Julia's afraid of you, Sandra. She won't even meet your eyes." Sandra's expression shifted, a flicker of something darker passing over her face. "She's a child, Tiago. Sometimes they need discipline, especially when they're acting out. Maybe Julia doesn't like the fact that I've set boundaries and that I'm not as lenient as you." At this, Julia's hands trembled slightly, and Tiago's heart ached at the sight. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "Boundaries don't leave bruises, Sandra," Tiago said, his voice tightening. "And they don't cause my daughter to live in fear." Sandra's mask of calm finally cracked. "Fine," she snapped, her voice laced with resentment. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to raise a child who's not even mine? To live up to the memory of your precious Elizabeth, while Julia looks at me like I'm the enemy? Maybe she needs a little discipline. Maybe that's what's wrong with her." The words sent a chill down Tiago's spine. He felt a surge of protectiveness swell within him, and his next words came out sharp and cold. "This is not about discipline, Sandra. This is about you crossing a line that no one has the right to cross. You betrayed the trust one placed in you and turned it into a weapon against my daughter." Sandra realized she had gone too far. "Tiago, wait. I didn't mean it like that." She backtracked, her tone softening as she attempted to regain control of the situation. "I love Julia. I got frustrated. Things have been difficult for me too." Tiago shook his head, his face hardening. "I don't care how difficult things have been for you. Julia deserves to feel safe in her own home, and it's clear she doesn't when you're here." Sandra looked desperate now, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you asking me to leave?" "I'm not asking, Sandra," he replied firmly. "You need to leave, and you need to leave now. I will not let you hurt my daughter again." Sandra's expression twisted into one of rage and desperation. "Fine, but don't think this is over. You'll regret this, Tiago." With that, she stormed off, grabbing her things and slamming the door behind her. As the sound of her footsteps faded, Tiago turned to Julia, pulling her into a protective embrace. "She's gone, my love. She won't be coming back." Julia looked up at him, her eyes filled with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Daddy. I was so scared." "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Tiago whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "From now on, it's just you and me, and I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe." For the first time in days, Julia smiled, a true, heartfelt smile that made Tiago's heart swell with love and pride. He knew the road to healing would be long, but they would walk it together, free from the fear and manipulation that had cast a shadow over their lives. As the night deepened, Tiago felt a renewed sense of purpose. His trust had been shattered, his family tested, but he was determined to rebuild their lives with Julia at the center. He realized that protecting his daughter was more than just a promise. It was the foundation of everything he held dear. Tiago looked Sandra directly in the eye, his voice steady. "You've already said enough, Sandra. There's nothing you can say to change what I saw and heard myself." Sandra's face shifted, her expression hardening as desperation leaked through her practiced calmness. "Tiago, you're being unreasonable. You're listening to a child who doesn't understand the world yet. I was only trying to help you raise her to be strong." But Tiago interrupted, his tone icy. "Help her? By scaring her, threatening her, and trying to make her lie. That's not help, Sandra. That's abuse. You had the chance to be part of our family, and you shattered it with your own actions." Sandra's shoulders slumped, realizing that she couldn't manipulate him any longer. Her face twisted into a mixture of anger and defeat, but she forced a smile. "You'll regret this, Tiago," she said through clenched teeth, before finally turning and walking away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. As soon as she was out of sight, Julia hugged her father's arm, relief flooding her face. Tiago looked down at her and gave her a reassuring smile. "She's gone, sweetheart, and she won't be able to hurt you ever again." Julia looked up, her big eyes full of gratitude and trust. "Thank you, Dad. I was so scared. But I knew you'd believe me in the end." Tiago hugged her tightly, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility and love. "I'm so sorry, Julia. From now on, I'll be paying attention. I won't let anyone make you feel afraid in your own home." The days that followed were filled with healing. Tiago took time off work, dedicating his days to spending time with Julia. They went to the park, shared her favorite meals, and made their home feel safe and warm again. Little by little, Julia's smile returned, her laughter filling the house once more. One evening, as they were winding down after a long day, Julia crawled onto her father's lap and wrapped her arms around him. "Dad, I feel happy again. I feel safe." Tiago smiled, his heart swelling with pride and relief. "And that's how it should be, Julia. You're safe now, and I'll always be here to make sure it stays that way." With Sandra's departure, their lives transformed. Tiago had learned a powerful lesson about trust, vigilance, and the responsibility of being a father. And Julia, with her bravery and resilience, taught him the true strength of love and the lengths he was willing to go to protect it. Together, they moved forward, stronger and closer than ever before, ready to face whatever life would bring. But now, side by side, in the months that followed, Tiago dedicated himself fully to rebuilding a life of peace and security with his daughter Julia. Determined to make their home a true sanctuary, he made some changes in their routines, with time together becoming a priority. Julia's sparkle returned little by little, her laughter filling every room in the house. Tiago had also been quietly working on an idea, a surprise for Julia, something that he hoped would not only bring joy, but also mark a new beginning for them both. One weekend morning, as the sun spilled golden light across the kitchen, Tiago asked Julia to join him at the table, where he had spread out a set of blueprints. "Julia, remember when you told me you wanted a treehouse?" he asked, smiling at her excited nod. "Well, I think it's about time we build it together. What do you think?" Julia's face lit up, her eyes wide with excitement. "Really? We're going to build a treehouse?" "Yes," Tiago replied with a grin. "A place just for you and me, where we can make new memories. A place that'll always be safe for you." They spent the following weekends working side by side, constructing the treehouse. Every nail they hammered in, every plank they placed, felt like a step away from the shadows of the past. Friends and neighbors even came to help, rallying around Tiago and Julia, creating a sense of community and support that had been absent during their dark days with Sandra. By the time they finished, the treehouse was beautiful, painted in soft colors Julia had chosen, with big windows that welcomed the sunlight and allowed her to feel surrounded by nature. Inside, they added a cozy reading nook, a small desk for drawing, and Julia's collection of books and stuffed animals. To her, it felt like a dream come true, and to Tiago, it was a symbol of the life they were rebuilding together. One quiet evening, as they sat in the treehouse looking out over the yard, Julia leaned her head on her father's shoulder. "Dad," she whispered, "thank you for believing in me. I was really scared, but I feel so happy now. This treehouse, it's like a new start." Tiago hugged her tightly, his heart full. "You're so brave, Julia. I'm the one who's grateful that you trusted me to make things right. This treehouse is just the beginning. We're going to fill our lives with wonderful memories together. As they sat in silence, watching the sky shift to a warm sunset, they both knew that they had come through something powerful. The pain of the past had made them stronger, and the bond they shared was unbreakable. With his daughter by his side, Tiago knew he had everything he needed to face whatever lay ahead. From that day forward, the treehouse became their special retreat, a place where they could always feel safe, loved, and connected, where their new story began, built on trust, resilience, and a love that would protect Julia forever.